Buckeye Talk coming to you from the Woody Hayes Athletic Center. We just talked to Ryan Day and a handful of players about Ohio State previewing the game Saturday against Maryland. Nathan Baird from cleveland.com. I'm here with Stephen Means and Doug Lesmerises. One of the standout performers from the win against Rutgers was Chris Olave. Had only 2 catches in the previous 2 games against Tulsa and Akron, and then had a kind of a big blowout, 5 catches, 119 yards, 2 touchdowns. Basically the kind of game that everyone expects from Chris Olave. And there was an interesting question, or maybe actually a better way to say it, an interesting answer today from Ryan Day about Chris Olave and how he kind of handled those 2 weeks and the sort of the process of keeping everybody happy in an offense right now that is explosive at times and highly productive, but also has a lot of dudes in it that can do a lot of good things, whether that's Trayvon Henderson or whether it's just kind of this whole stable of running backs. Just, Doug, what did you take from the way that Ryan Day talked about that relationship today?
I thought it was interesting because for people who remember 2015, in 2015, Ohio State had a ridiculous amount of offensive talent, and they had a hard time divvying up the touches, and it negatively affected them. That was the first time I was like, too much talent or whatever. It's like they did a poor job of sort of keeping a flow to the offense while still keeping everybody involved. So for Ryan Day sort of on his own to bring up the idea of like, hey, Chris Olave is like a really highly motivated guy who sets a high standard for himself, but he also understands that sometimes the ball's not going to come your way because teams are covering you and it opens other things up. It's like, oh, they must have talked about that after he had 2 catches in 2 games. And so it's not an issue, and that it was not a coincidence to me that Olave had a big game against Rutgers, but it's interesting to hear Ryan Day sort of put that out there. And so I followed up and said, like, hey, do you have to manage that as one of the things as a play caller? And he said, yeah, but you can't worry about it too much. And so it's not an issue. I don't think it's an issue. But clearly, to me, Ryan Day and Chris Olave had a conversation, and then everybody's happy and got back on track. But that is a reality. If you lived through 2015, you understand that. That is a reality when you have this many talented offensive players. It can crop up.
To whatever extent you would think about that as a coach, I think the way Ohio State's season had started probably means Ryan Day could take that into consideration less, right? That there's only so much you can care about how you're spreading the ball around and keeping people happy as opposed to just producing yards and points when you have already lost a game, when you were only a touchdown ahead of Tulsa with 4 minutes to play or whatever it was. Stephen, I guess just how do you see that breakdown? How much can a coach really care about how much that distribution is happening and keeping players happy that way, as opposed to just maybe, I guess, setting kind of the expectations, the underlying expectations, and players knowing that it'll get back to them eventually the way it did for Olave?
I think there is a balance between trying to get a guy going, obviously with stuff where it's clearly it's going to that guy, whether it's bubble screens or those jet sweeps and stuff where you just want to get the ball in somebody's hands. I'm glad you brought up 2015 because one of the key things about that season was they also couldn't get the quarterback situation figured out. So when you're dealing with that and you've got too much talent, you end up with Michael Thomas not getting the ball as much as he should have. It's clear that they've got this quarterback situation figured out. C.J. Stroud's healthy. He wasn't healthy against Akron, which probably played a little bit into it. You're starting a brand-new quarterback once again, and so it's a little haywire at times, and obviously C.J. Stroud the first 3 weeks had to settle in. Now that they've gotten that settled in, they can have that balance. If you're going to rank the hierarchy from a weapon standpoint of who's going to get the ball, it starts with Trayvon as your running back, which clearly established himself as a dominant back, and then it's probably Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson in whatever order you want to put it in, and then you're sprinkling in Jackson Smith and Jigba as well. Now that you've gotten your personnel kind of figured out, now you can start to divvy up the talent, divvy up the touches however way you see fit. But also, some of this is just going to be as C.J. Stroud grows into his own here, who gets open faster, which is when you have this much talent is kind of the challenge as a wide receiver when you've got the 2 best wide receivers in the country and another 5 stars. A lot of times it's who gets open the fastest when C.J. Stroud is reading the field.
The only game that stands out to me as weird for Olave was the Tulsa game, where you get to the end and he has 0 catches, and you were kind of like, what? And we didn't even, I don't think, realize it at the time, almost. You know what I mean? It was almost like a post-game thing, like, oh, hey, Chris Olave had 0 catches. He only really plays, like, the first half against Akron. He really only played the first half against Rutgers. I think when you get into some of these games later in the season, Penn State, Michigan, probably Michigan State, maybe even Indiana, they can hang around for a while. You're going to need 4 quarters worth of those guys, and some of that's going to settle out just by having them play a full game, right?
No, I think so, and it's I think it's just about feeling involved. I'm sure. Listen, we're not talking about it because we're saying it's a problem. We're talking about it because it's a reality, and that there's a difference between a reality and a problem. So this, like, they're working it out, which is great. But even like Mel Kiper's draft board, he did his draft board the other day, and like Jahan Dotson's #1 for draft eligible receivers, and it's like, I'm not saying Chris Olave is like mad about that, but I would imagine he could probably heard about it. It's like, well, why is Jahan Dotson #1? Well, because he gets all the balls at Penn State, and Chris and Garrett are right in the top 5. But it's like that kind of stuff, right? That you want to put up numbers, but you also want to feel involved. So far this year, Garrett Wilson 26 catches, Chris Olave 23, Jackson Smith-Njigba 18. So like everything's fine. I just think it's before 2015, I thought it was like whatever. And like having learned my lesson, I will now always think it's an interesting conversation as you work through boatloads of offensive talent.
Quick thing I want to add to that. I'm glad the draft point is well taken, because that's part of. I mean, Michael Thomas fell to the second round. That's going to be something that's interesting to watch as Ohio State continues to recruit wide receivers at this level. If they are consistently developing into being in a conversation to be the best player at their position, does the fact that they're having to share the wealth with other guys who are equally as talented, by a guy like Jahan Dotson is going to get 100 catches this year just because who else are they going to throw the ball to? Does that continue to impact draft stock going forward, especially when you're just this too early in the process like right now? Not necessarily on draft day, but when you start the conversation 6 months before.
Jahan Dotson also might legitimately be better than those guys. He's really good. That's not a knock against Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, whoever. He's really good. And the other questions that Ryan Day's getting today, kind of to bring this all around, like he's also getting questions like, does Trevion Henderson need to get the ball more because he's only had 16 carries in the past 2 weeks or whatever, partially because there were circumstances against Rutgers where he got hurt. So that's part of this too, that like it's not just how are you getting the ball to all these receivers. It's like, don't you need to get the ball to Trevion Henderson 20 to 25 times a game to let him crush teams the way that he can? So there are some moving parts. I think, Doug, I think you're right that it's a reality that coaches have to take into account. Does not mean it's necessarily a problem for Ohio State. We'll be bringing you more intel via the text all week, so get those 614-350-3315 pregame, during the game, postgame, when they play Maryland on Saturday.